Oh, the first thing we want to do is just to thank you all for coming, to welcome you. We want to know where you're calling in or dialing in from. So if you can share in the chat box to let us know, like, your name, where you're dialing in from, what your expectations are for our conversation this evening, and yeah, some of the interesting things you pulled out of this section of the book. And Dr. Drew Hart and we will be taking a look at that as we go through our conversation tonight. But thank you all for joining us. Again, I'm the visionary founder of Leadership Links. I'm also the author of the book we're discussing tonight and the president of T3 Leadership Solutions. So thank you all for participating. This is what we are giving away this evening. So we want to thank our sponsors for this series, InterVarsity Press, who is the publisher of this book. And one thing they're doing this evening is they're giving away a book bundle. We are also going to send you a few things from my business and from Leadership Links. And so if you have not already entered into the giveaway, this is your chance. This is your last chance to do that. We encourage you to share. If you're on Facebook, to share this live video, to tell people you're watching and inviting them to join in. But we should share a link in the Zoom chat box as well as on Facebook in the comments, so you can enter the giveaway. So we want to encourage you to do that. Next, I want to remind you that InterVarsity Press has graciously set up a virtual bookstore for us this summer. And so between now and the end of July, if you use the Becoming Me, the link that you see here, you can enroll there and get the discount code for 40% off any books you buy off of their website. So we want to encourage you to do that, because we are an education institution and we encourage you to increase in your knowledge. Lastly, I'm going to share a little bit about Leadership Links before we get started and before I introduce my conversation partner for this evening. Leadership Links is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We exist to educate and equip servant leaders who are using their skills and resources for the greater good of humanity. Our mission is to offer leadership education that facilitates impactful living, character, and spiritual development. So we develop leaders holistically here through our 5 core values of love, inspiration, network, knowledge, and service. And the beautiful thing about our network is that we have an intergenerational, multi-ethnic network, and all of us are really investing in purpose to raise up the next generation of leaders. So you may see on social media that we do a lot of programming with leadership and mentoring, specifically our first round of programming with middle and high school girls. And so that's the passion of ours. And we'll continue to do that even in spite of a pandemic. We're doing a lot of great virtual work, and this is one of the things that we're offering in that. So let me share our organizational video and then introduce our guests.
In August of 2015, Leadership Links established itself as a nonprofit organization from what began as a yearning desire to encourage, equip, and mentor both aspiring and practicing leaders would flourish into community building, mentorship, and spiritual enrichment, driven by its mission to offer leadership education that facilitates impactful living, character, and spiritual development. Leadership Links guides others in developing and refining their best selves.
It's important for her to be around like-minded individuals where she can feel free to express herself and not feel uncomfortable about being a leader. And I just appreciate everything that this program has done for my daughter.
Dedicated to connecting people with purpose, Leadership Links delivers leadership training, conducts summer programs, hosts networking events, and establishes impactful mentoring relationships to slingshot people towards their goals. Making an impact on those around you is inevitable, especially when giving the right combination of love, inspiration, a strong network, knowledge, and a heart to serve. This is who we are. It's what we do. It's why we exist.
With inspiration, Leadership Links taught me how to be confident and when I take a different path than other people. And I actually found out that I inspire others when I go my own way in life. I love to volunteer in my community, and Leadership Links has helped me and connected me to other volunteer services.
We believe that this was ordained by God. We are in partnership with some wonderful people who really have a passion and a thirst to see the youth in our community reach their dreams, walk in their purpose, and to really grow and to fulfill their potential.
Here we're able to express ourselves freely in the no judgment zone. We're able to share ideas and be able to bounce ideas off of one another to not only make ourselves succeed, but others as well.
Grounded by desire to serve, its founding board members are all military veterans who find that service is just as important, in or out of uniform.
It's about all of us pushing ourselves to give our very best of what all of us have to offer to make our children better and to help their dreams to come true.
God is the one who created us in His image and for a purpose. And in knowing Him, our Links leaders can walk in purpose and learn how to love others well.
Sometimes it appears that there are plenty of reasons to feel doubtful about humanity, but there is a light. There are people devoted to helping others, teaching others, and believing in others. Be a part of the good going on in the world. Join the network, provide support, lend your time, change a life. Link up.
I get happy every time I see that video. And thank you all for sharing your things. I'll be engaging you as soon as I get done sharing here, but I want to introduce you to my friend, Dr. Arthur, father, husband, brother, advocate, Dr. Drew G.I. Hart. He's a professor of theology at Messiah University in Pennsylvania. He has over 10 years of pastoral ministry experience, has worked in after-school programs with mentoring boys. He's an organizer, a community activist. He loves working for justice. He's the author of Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism. He utilizes in that book everyday stories and Jesus-shaped lessons and anti-racism frameworks to transform the church's understanding and social witness. Thank you. He continues to write everywhere. He also serves as a co-host of the Inverse podcast, along with an Australian peace activist, Gerard McKenna. His newest book project is entitled Who Will Be a Witness? Subtitle, Igniting Activism for God's Justice, Love, and Deliverance. And it will be published on September 1st, 2020, but it is available for pre-order now everywhere books are sold. So I encourage you to get that. He's won numerous awards. He's a family man, married, lives in Harrisburg with his wife and his children. Welcome, my friend.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that really kind introduction. And I'm just so grateful to be in conversation with you. I love your work. And I just want to say, it's funny, as someone who originally gave a blurb and endorsement for the book, rereading it a second time, I was like, oh my goodness, I forgot how good this book was. This is so amazing. And so I really enjoyed just kind of refreshing, especially in the history section, and just how timely it was. And so I'm really excited about this conversation right now.
That's gracious of you. I really appreciate that. You know, I don't take that stuff lightly at all. And I remember you and I like to do a formal and informal introduction, but I feel like we were online buddies before we actually physically met for a while.
For a while.
And then I remember the first time I remember us meeting was at a conference in DC. This was your wife. This is what I remember about it. We were at a restaurant, for some kind of after conference thing. And I saw you from across the room because I don't think I knew you were going to be there. And I saw you from across the room and I was like, wow. And so we went and caught up and you were telling me, the first thing I remember you saying was that your wife was pregnant and you were just kind of beaming with excitement about that. And I was encouraged. And I like to share stories like that because I'm so blessed. Like I'm always around a lot of just great people, but also a lot of great Black men, and there are lots of them. And so I think for the context of the conversation tonight too, I don't want to miss the opportunity to say, not only are you excellent and intelligent and a Jesus lover and a husband and a wife, but you're just a good man. And so I appreciate that about you.
Oh, thank you, Natasha. Really appreciate that. Thank you. Well, let's
talk tonight.
Let's jump into conversation. And so, I mean, I really like the history section's got 3 sections, chapter 5,
Yeah.
6, and 7, and the first one is on consciousness.
Yeah,
And I guess what was fascinating for me, so like at Messiah University, like one of the things that we love to talk about is race and place, right? How these things play, because you can talk abstractly, then what does it mean for how it shapes like a particular place and context?
Yeah.
And what I love about what you do in your story is you just kind of unfold it. And so the first thing I wanted us to kind of maybe think about this idea of race and place is you talk about Orangeburg and something that happens there that honestly, without reading it from your book, I don't think I would have even known about this history. And so can you share a little bit about what was so formative in terms of this event that happened in Orangeburg and kind of shaped the context that you grew up in?
Yeah, and I'm glad to do it. And I think it's a good thing too, because, as you and I, we love to educate too, and we love to teach, and we let that be in conversation with real people and real things. And so as I'm sharing my story, one of the things I'm encouraged by, and I know you are too, and you write, is that like we all have a race and place story.
That's right.
Right. Like we all have a race and place story. And I think sometimes we talk about race in our country and people think, oh, we segregated, right? Like this is Black history and this is, their thing. And this is what happened in Tulsa and this is what happened in Alabama. But we don't talk about what happened in your kitchen, in your living room, in your boardroom. And so I want us, as we are, talking tonight, we're going to talk a lot about, this book and this story. But as we do that, I want to encourage the people that are listening and you can start sending questions now because we'll be answering throughout later on this evening, but to think about your race and place story as well. And so for me, I grew up in a small town of Orangeburg, South Carolina. And so I'm a Southern Black girl. And obviously when we had a conversation about Michelle Obama's book and she watched in her documentary, I remember her saying, she was like, I'm a Black girl from the South side of Chicago. And she's saying, that's everything you need to know about me. And that's how I feel about Orangeburg, right? Like I'm a Black girl from Orangeburg, South Carolina. That's everything you need to know about me. And what that means is there's a lot of Black excellence, right? There's 2 historically Black colleges and universities there. It's a lot of Black people. It's pretty much almost, it's pretty segregated, right? And so I saw a lot of that. And then, everybody have their 10%. That's what we say in the Marine Corps, right? And so some of the things that we see as myths and stereotypes, that was absolutely there, right? Which means I have a little bit of ghetto in me. Right. Right. And so I can go from the hood to the White House easy. That's right. Right. And so that's kind of what my history is. And so there's also this steep history of the civil rights movement. And so I think what people don't remember or they don't know is that this movement, on one hand, if you just look at the Montgomery Bus Boycott, right, that was championed by and large by poor domestic Black women. Yeah. Those were the organizers of that initiative. Now, those aren't the names that we raise up, but those were the people that sustained that. And then when you had their white advocate allies, a lot of them were the white women that they worked for because they couldn't keep house without them, right? And so the same thing, when I think about my own town, there was a massacre in my hometown where we had a bowling alley. This is a bowling alley I drove past just almost every day because it was right next door to the Piggly Wiggly where we got groceries, right? And so by the time I was of age, to read and understand, the bowling alley was closed, but it was it's like abandoned building, but in the window, it was a glass window, there was 3 black and white pictures of these young men, and these not young men, they were boys. I think it's important that we say they were teenagers, 17, 18-year-old boys. So these were boys that were in college. They were attending South Carolina State College, which is now university. And they were a part of a series of peaceful protests because they were trying to desegregate the bowling alley. There was not another bowling alley within like a 20-mile radius of the town. And things escalated pretty quickly. We have seen in our present day how these things escalate pretty quickly. And long story short, these boys end up getting murdered by the police.
Right.
There was also, now I knew that. What I did not know until a few years ago when I visited I can't remember the first time I heard of it, but I think I read the book about the massacre, but I knew the story before I read the book.
Yeah.
And then I think the book told me, and then I visited the International History Museum in Greensboro, North Carolina, where we used to live, and it was there too. And so there was a college student who was a Black woman. She was married and pregnant and got beaten by the cops. And then she miscarried her child like a week later. And so we count that death as a murder as well, for those who care about life in and outside of the womb, right? Because we can't select when we care about that. And so, here it is, this woman was traumatized. And so these were stories like these were stories that, I just grew up with. It was a part of our history. And so it just was very formative about the place where I grew up.
Yeah. Wow. And what I tell people often, because there's a lot of conversation around Tulsa right now, right? Tulsa. And I was like, what we don't realize is that this was happening all over the country, and there's multiple Tulsas and multiple racial violence and cleansing of the lands, and just the kind of racial violence and terrorism that Black people faced, often for backlash, right? Precisely for standing up and speaking up about what was happening around them, that we see this racial violence. And it's really conscious raising, right, to begin to realize the actual history of our nation and how it impacts different communities.
Yeah, and let me ask you this too, because it's very interesting. So one, you said Tulsa. I don't want to assume that everyone knows what happened in Tulsa, so that would be a good opportunity. But the other one is, because this is a series of conversations, right? And so we ended the conversation last week. All right, come on, page 65 through 68. We're gonna get there, Sandy. I love that content, but we have this history of, when we think about at the end of the conversation, one of the questions we got that, I feel like I partially answered, but I thought this segment was really a good part to answer, because one person asked something along like, well, do you think there's racism still happening, and what do you think needs to happen for Black people to pull themselves up by their, they didn't say by their own bootstraps, but what do they need to do to better themselves, like Dr. Ben Carson? So Dr. Ben Carson was used as an example of what Black people should be and what they should do. And so, I try to say very quickly, just for the sake of getting several questions in, but I think it's a good one I want to pose to you of, Black people have been working and doing all the right things. And there was a New York Times article that was just published, I think last week, about this, that when Black people do all the things that we're told we should do to pull ourselves up, if you will, to get equity in society, we still don't have the same things that our white counterparts that are doing the same things have.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we think it from a historical standpoint, often, like one thing that often I will hear sometimes from some white people is, oh, well, my grandfather worked hard, right?
Right.
And I'm like, no doubt. I have no doubt that they didn't work hard. And guess what? Black folks, our grandparents were working hard too, right? Yes. I mean, think about, especially early 20th century, I mean, the vast majority of them are sharecropping. I mean, there's not much harder work that you can be doing, right? Yeah. But what's happening at that moment that people forget is that in the early 20th century, you have the progressive era laws, right? And so you have these laws that are coming into place. There's almost a no middle class at all for white people in the early 20th century. And these laws are created to help white people thrive, right? Government handouts, loans, all kinds of stuff. And then going into 30s with the New Deal and GI bills, right? Earlier before that was the Homestead Act. So you have all these laws in place that allow white people that helps their work actually produce something. But Black people were intentionally excluded from those policies, from those loans, from the Homestead Acts, from the GI bills, and all those things. And so hard work in and of itself has never been the primary factor for Black people's well-being, right?
Right.
And so we've got to just dismiss this myth that somehow hard work correlates into a certain kind of life. The fact of the matter is that this nation was built on slavery. It was built on Black people's hard work and them not getting anything in response to that. And so we need to tell more truthful stories. And then on top of it, then you have places like Tulsa, right? So around 1919, 1920, 1921, there's all these racial violence moments that are like exploding throughout the country, but Tulsa in particular, you have this thriving, and we gotta be careful not to overstate, right? Because sometimes we make it like, but certainly for their time period, they're thriving and making possible what seemed impossible in other spaces. So their conditions were just right for them to kind of begin to build businesses and structures on, own and
what did the government do when all these Black people start building things and pulling themselves up? What did the government do?
I mean, well, in that particular, remember, they're not getting the same kind of government assistance that white people are getting. But then all of a sudden you have extreme racial violence in response to it. I mean, literally in fact, the intervention of the government was literally not arresting. And in many ways, it seems like they had police, I think, participating in the racial violence that Black people were experiencing at that moment. And so it's just horrifying to think about after, by that point, maybe 60 years struggling, trying to build something, and then everything's taken from you, everything that you work for. And they've got to flee for their lives. And so they're refugees at that moment again. And this happened all over the country. Again, this is what happened in Tulsa was one of the more severe in terms of just the pure number of Black people that were killed and harmed. But this was happening all over the country. And so we've got to, again, just tell more truthful stories about how Black people have struggled. The issue has never been that we haven't had hardworking, intelligent, gifted Black people. They've always existed in this country. Right. The challenge is what conditions have white people created to allow Black people to flourish? And in what ways have they intentionally stifled through policies and through defunding and disinvestment and plundering of Black communities, harms Black people from thriving?
Tell the truth. Tell the truth.
So you talk about kind of coming to consciousness as a teenager in your book. Like that's a really interesting thing. Like, can you say a little bit about like how you kind of were, what was it that shaped you to see the world and to understand the racial realities that you were kind of being born into?
Yeah, I think race, I don't remember race being something that was taught or talked about a whole bunch in my home. I don't remember that. I remember reading a lot. I remember being exposed to a lot. So for example, in the first part of the book, I write about the Helen Sherfield Girls Club, and the woman who was over that, and that's a program I was in for 4 years of high school. She was a lifetime member of the NAACP, she was, and so my mother, when my dad had his roofing business, she had a small office downtown. And I remember sitting in the office, as a young person. And then when it was time to vote, riding around the car and walking down the street with my mother with pamphlets and T-shirts, getting people registered to vote, so they can have a voice. I remember when I was in high school, I got to the end of my senior year of high school, and I'd already been accepted to several schools. I'd already had full scholarships to several schools, and the Naval Academy was kind of out there lingering, and I had not finished my application. And my mother was encouraging me just to finish it, to keep my options open. My guidance counselor is like, oh, girl, that's a good school, And so there was something about the Naval Academy that seemed like it was different or it was somehow better than the other schools I had been accepted at. That was the perception. And I remember I had a high school, my Western civilization teacher who was a white man, and I adored him. We had a great relationship. And I was asking him, kind of give me some counsel about the college, making the decision about college, because at some point you got to make a choice, right?
Right.
And I remember him saying to me, sweetheart, you've done well here, but this is not the real world. Because it was like 98, 99% Black kids.
Right.
He said, this is not the real world. He said, you need to go somewhere where you can compete, because I believe you can compete with the best of them. And that was very interesting. And so, by the time I left high school, I'm 18, right? And then going from an environment like that, where everyone's affirming, everyone's loving, everyone's, challenging you to do the best and be the best. And then to go into an environment very quickly within a year or two where people don't think you can do anything at all. Like somehow somebody gave you a handout
Right.
to get what they got. And if you got what they got, that you took it from them. You didn't earn it. You didn't work hard for it. You didn't do the same things they did to get there. And then I was exposed to, like, it was just interesting to me that I was exposed for the first time to conversations that I didn't even know was happening, right? So I said about the Naval Academy experience, I'm going to graduate and I'm thankful they're going to give me a job, right? Mm-hmm. And you had another generation of my peers, not all of them, but a lot of them that were being invited into another next generation of wealth building, right? It wasn't just about the job or the career, it was about the network. Right. And even today, I do not have the same benefits of being a Naval Academy grad like that most of the white men have, right? Not for job opportunity, not for networking, not for pay, not for any of those things. So I think, these are systemic things that we don't talk about. And sometimes we don't talk about it because we don't even see it.
Right. Yeah. Now, I'm thinking also about, I was fascinated rereading, like, how so much has happened in your region. I mean, just so much. And so you mentioned the Emmanuel 9, and that's not that far, and even folks that were connected to that church. And you also mentioned Bree Newsom. I forgot that was in there. I was like, and that just seems so timely, this moment, right? So I'm kind of curious, thinking about how close to home some of that was for you, and then also this national conversation that's happening right now, right, to try to tie it into the present around Confederate monuments. Like, what are your thoughts on the people are talking about whether you should or shouldn't, take down monuments? What are your thoughts on some of these things?
It's very interesting. It's very interesting to me. I remember, you and I, we do all kinds of work. And so I do some consulting work. I do some leadership consulting work, some diversity, equity work. And so a few years ago, this is probably 2 or 3 years ago, I was doing this work with school administrators. So this is a K through 12 school, private Christian school.
Yeah.
And this issue came up about Confederate monuments. And I was doing this work with a colleague who was a Black man. And so he mentioned something about Colin Kaepernick taking a knee and why he was taking a knee. And we may not agree with him taking a knee, but we need to be willing to listen to the issues that he's being raised in this peaceful protest. And one of the administrators, white male, just almost attacked them, like verbally attacked them. Like, what do you say to the parents whose son fought, in the Confederacy and died in the Confederacy, and, and all these things. And before my colleague could even answer, he goes, and this is the power move, right? Have you lost a son? Right? And so before my colleague can answer, I said, I've lost a son, right? Because I have, right? Yeah. And also, though, I'm a veteran and my colleague is not, right? So this way that you was try to silence him, right? You can't silence me in the same way,
right?
Because I understand that too, right? Like I've raised my hand and been willing to lay down my life. Have you done that, right? Because you're not a veteran, right? And so it just kind of leveled the playing field there. And I think, we shouldn't have to do that to listen well to each other.
Right.
But because he was trying to silence, then I needed to bring the conversation back to what the conversation was. And I think the important thing when we're having conversations like this, and I've said there's a difference, and I talk about this in the book too, right? Like an artifact and what's the proper place for an artifact, right? And so that's what you have museums for.
Right.
You have museums because we want to remember and tell a history. That's different between being in a public space where we're celebrating something.
That's right.
Right.
That's
And
right.
I think the other difference in that is that the truth is, right, losing is very un-American. There's no place ever in this country where we celebrate losing. It's just this one area where we feel we want to set up monuments and statues and celebration for the people that lost the war. And so then my question and my challenge is, what is that about? That's about something else, right? And I would submit it's about power. It's about white supremacy, racism. I think some of these things are in, and I think we need to just be honest about that. Right? This is not just about veterans and military personnel and people dying, right? It's about what was the war about, and it wasn't just state rights.
That's right. State rights to keep slaves.
Right. It wasn't, and so, and I think we have an opportunity to have these conversations. Obviously, Hamilton just came out as a film on Disney, and we're having different conversations with kids, and there was some banner in there about this, right? Like, you can fight because like you're not paying, you're not in debt because you're not paying for things, right? And so I think we have to just to your point and to the point of the title of the book, tell the truth about this history.
Yes.
Because the word tells us that the truth will set us free. Right. And so the evil people or the mean people are not the people that's calling us to tell the truth.
Right. Yeah. And it's so, you think about like, you don't go to Germany, you're not going to see them celebrating Nazi statues and Confederates, right?
No.
Because they've had to do some truth telling. You go to South Africa, right?
You go to or Rwanda, which I write about in a book, right?
They've done some truth telling, right? But we've never really, I know there's like official apologies, but we've never done truth telling. And so there's just so much denial in this country. And like you said, people can frame it as, education and we're distorting history. It's not distorting history, right? You don't have KKK hoodies, just out on the street. Those are in museums, right? In this proper place. So we can tell a proper story of how these things were used. The full story, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this is about celebration, and it's about distorting the truth and our actual history and claiming a whole different kind of narrative. And so we've got to find the courage somehow to tell the truth.
Yeah, we need to.
So towards the end of chapter 5, you engage the Exodus story, and some of what you do I think is really beautiful because it allows us to, in some ways, like it turns us to like the consciousness of God, right? Literally, like God is the one that sees and knows our suffering, and you help us really see that. Why is that important for us to see a conscious God who responds and acts to the suffering of others?
Yeah, I'm gonna go back now to your we were just talking about trouble I've seen. So one of the things you wrote here in your book, trouble I've seen, I'm gonna pull it up because I think it's really, really important for this this conversation we're having. So I'm gonna find it. But I think the main thing here is because in reflecting on this Exodus narrative, there's a lot of content there, right? There's a lot of content there. But I think the main thing that we get to see is that there is a narrative because there was an oppressed people, and those oppressed people cried out to God. And the Bible says that God heard them. And his solution or his offering to them is, I heard you. And because I heard you, is I'm going to send Moses. I'm going to send Moses. And so God raises up, I think, conscious people that God chooses to engage humans in his word, right? He doesn't need us to be engaged, but he chooses to engage us in his word. And so I think for all of us, you know, as part of this truth-telling piece, is that we have an opportunity to avail ourselves to be agents of God, because God is a God of justice. And that's evident throughout, you know, when we read the whole text.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love how there's a quote that you have towards the end where it says, sometimes his answer to the cries and needs of the people is you, right?
Come on.
It's almost like they say sometimes when you pray the Lord's Prayer, you know, and you pray, you know, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth that is in heaven. And then all of a sudden, you come up from your prayer and you realize you've got to be your prayer, right? You've got to embody that good news for other folks on the ground. Yeah.
Yeah, and then Sandy was just sharing the excerpt from page 73 when I was writing about what did she say here, that she done quote the whole thing. I don't expect any significant movement on this spectrum from any person who doesn't claim to know Christ, because within the body of Christ, however, I do believe that we have a responsibility to educate ourselves about our history, hold to each other accountable to Christ's standards, and to work together to become loving, united, and righteous people. It is true, and I think that's important, Drew, and you can talk about this too, is that because as people of faith, there's a way that we engage the world, and then there's a way that we engage the church.
Right.
And I have to remind people in the church that these issues that we're talking about, they're first spiritual, and it's spiritual warfare. And we don't like to talk about that a lot. And we have to name that too, because my posture is, that's the only reason it's been able to stand as long as it has, right? Because it's a principality and power.
Right.
And so when you have a principality and power, you can't go about that just with, you know, fighting any kind of way, right? There's a very spiritual and deep and rich and engaged and communal way I think we have to fight. Yeah. And as we honor the Lord, you know, even in that fight. And so I think that's important too, to point out. And that's why I say we need Jesus, because I don't know any other way to get the job done.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And I think, I mean, to that point, so in the next chapter, I mean, it's called Deliverance. And really, when I think about how you use the language of deliverance there, like it's neither all spiritual or all social and political. It's like holistic, right? I mean, that's what you talk a little bit about, like how you understand deliverance.
Well, it's kind of like freedom.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if we fully put our hands on it, but we also know what it's not.
Yeah.
Right. And so at best, you know, freedom is kind of like, you know, what the Bible says about faith is the evidence of those things we hope for, the evidence of, you know, we might not yet see. And so deliverance is, in my view, it's a discipline, a journey, spiritual and physical, of walking towards that freedom, right? Walking towards this kingdom that you know we pray about, like you said, this kingdom we pray about, that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. that our theologian, the theologians say we live in the now and not yet kingdom of God, and that there are times when we see glimpses at best of what God's hope is for his creation.
Yeah.
And that's what we work with, that vision in mind.
Yeah.
Because we know what our present reality is not what God had in mind.
Right. Yeah. Amen. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that struck me also in this chapter, you emphasized the Christian responsibility to know our history. And I guess
Yes.
the reason why it really hits me is because, I teach a course called the Politics of Blackness. It's a course I get to do it for fun. It's a first-year
I want to do it
course.
for fun. I don't want
Yeah.
to teach it. I want to attend it for fun. Go ahead.
That's what everyone always tells me at Messiah, because when they hear what I'm doing. So it's like Black history and Black intellectual thought kind of all smudged together, a little theology at the end. So it's not a part of my like normal teaching load.
Right.
And but what happens is every semester I have students come into the class, and first-year students, and they enter in, they're kind of naive, they enter in, they start doing history. Just a lot of it we spend on like 20th century history, like just because. And what happens every single time is they come out saying like, I feel like I've been lied to my whole life, and I always say to them, like, I know you've been taught that, the 20th century was just about like water fountains and sitting at the back of the bus, which those were humiliating things in and of themselves.
Sure.
But that they missed that there was just so much more going on, right?
Right.
They never even heard of convict leasing systems or sharecropping or chain gangs or all these neo-slavery things. Some of them never even heard of the word lynching, right? And didn't know what it was. And I'm thinking like, what is, and so they don't know that 5,000 Black men, women, and children were lynched and all the racial terrorism that took place.
Right.
They don't really have grasps. The kind of literally trying to control Black bodies, right? It's all of that. And so, this emphasis that Christians have a responsibility to know our history in this land is really powerful when you think about I call it sometimes willful ignorance, right? Like the intentional not knowing, right?
Yeah.
Not passing the stories on from one generation to generation that many white evangelical students that come into my classroom, like that's their lived experience that they don't know.
And it's the privilege of not having to know.
Right.
A privilege of not having to deal with it. And really, it's very interesting because, like, again, if we're thinking about what's happening right now, so we think about when George Floyd got murdered, right?
Right.
And then all this social media activity start happening, and people were saying, some people were, saying to me like, Natasha, what are you gonna do? I said, I'm gonna do the stuff I always been doing. Like, I'm not gonna stop what I'm doing, which is pursuing justice work and telling the truth and doing good theology and serving people that God has, called me to, and doing, leadership work. Like, I'm not gonna stop that and be distracted just because you got woke yesterday.
Right.
Right. So only thing I can offer you is the stuff that I already put out for you to do, right? And I think you have that of, at best, people are just learning. At worst, it's just a social performance.
Yeah.
And I'm concerned about that. I am concerned about that.
Yeah.
And I also know that part of this is about the poverty of our education system, right?
Yeah, that's right.
We don't teach the full story in school. And so right now, my daughter and I, we're reading through this book, which I recommend for young people, The Young People's History of America. And so it tells the American history story from the posture of the oppressed, starting with the indigenous people. And so it's very interesting, and I'm glad they're doing that. And so we're getting to read that together, and that's a resource that I would recommend to read, just to expose yourself to that. But I think the other thing about me, if I were to put myself back in Orangeburg as someone who took college prep classes, honors classes, AP classes, I took AP history. And the way we were given history was names and dates, right? Just stuff to memorize for a test and brain dump. So I actually graduated high school. I didn't know any history. It was one of the things I was embarrassed about when I got to the Naval Academy because they kind of expect you to know that stuff. Right. I was very embarrassed. And so, but I didn't really start to really enjoy history and love history until I got to seminary. Right. When I started studying early church history, because my professor loved early church history and he taught early church history as if he loved early church history. Right. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is fascinating. Right. Because it was presenting in a way that says this is important, this makes sense. And it's something that if you grab hold to it, you can connect the dots to it and everything else you're studying. Right. Yeah. And so I think we've missed that opportunity for all of the time we've been educating people in America. And so really for adults and for Christians, this discipline, and we always talk about spiritual discipline, it needs to include this posture of becoming a lifelong learner about these things that we don't even know. I mean, to your point, like you didn't know about Orangeburg Massacre. There's a ton of things. As I read, Drew, what I realize is that the more I read, the more I get to understand what I don't know. Right. Like I just bought a book last week about, I think when affirmative action was white. Right. I know that. I have that book. Right. So the more you read, the more you realize it's like peeling an onion back, right? Or an orange or something. But like there are all kind of layers and pieces of this. It's like, oh my goodness, we don't know anything. Right. And at some point, we're going to stop calling this Christopher Columbus Day, right? That's right. Because we're going to stop doing that. I've read the journals. I've read some of that stuff. It's horrifying. It's horrifying. Yes. I've read some of that stuff. Yeah. Right. But it was not in grade school. Right. They didn't teach us that. Right. They did not teach us that. And so it's dangerous when you have this this false narrative that kind of floats above what actually happens. Right. And then people are making decisions on this kind of myth story that actually is not parallel with what actually happened at all. You can't have meaningful conversations when we don't all have at least some basic understanding of where we've come from, right? And I think it's important to kind of get there. Yeah. So you have this Fannie Lou Hamer quote. I'll quote it. It says from your book on page 84, "We've got to have some changes in this country, and not only changes for the Black man and only changes for the Black woman, but the changes we have in this country are going to be for liberation of all people, because nobody's free until everybody's free." Why is that so important? Oh, brother, you're getting into some of my doctorate work now, because I'm trying to, like, I got a whole bunch. I'm trying to kind of focus zone in. What I'm coming to understand, not that I didn't know before, is that in my reading of Black women narratives, and I would say specifically Black women leadership narratives, and so someone like a Fannie Lou Hamer, right, is that when Black women get to work and they're able to succeed in that work, and I'm talking about community organizing, I'm talking about public service, I'm talking about leadership, those type things, what they have a tendency and a history and a track record of doing is making things better for everybody. Yeah. That's what happens. And so here you have Fannie Lou Hamer who could say, I only care about Black people things, or I only care about women things. And she's saying, we either all gonna go in the same direction together, or we're not gonna, get there at all. Right. And that's the message of like a Ida B. Wells. That's a message of like a Sojourner's Truth. It's a message of like a Harriet Tubman. I mean, there's so Ella many. Baker. There are so many stories about that. And so I think there's a way that we have to start as a part of our historical work, unearthing the stories of these Black women too, because what we have done, because of not just white supremacy and racism, but because of patriarchy, like we've elevated the male voice, all right, and the charismatic male leader, and not to discount anything that they've done, but there's no success of MLK without these domestic women who do this Montgomery Bus Boycott, or Ella Baker, who challenged him to say, hey, y'all not listening to the poor Black people. Right? It's not just about y'all who are educated. You got to listen to the poor Black people. And why are we not going to talk to them and registering them to vote, right? Or Prathia Hall, who I just found out about last year, and she was the first one that delivered the I Have a Dream refrain that MLK heard, and then he delivered, and we don't even know her name. I didn't know her name until last year. Right? And so there are all kinds of ways that Black women have served as liberators, not just for themselves, but for humanity in this country. And I want us to start unearthing their stories and raising their names and as well.
Yeah, that's good. So before, I don't want to make sure we get to chapter 7 some.
Yes.
And so in this chapter, what captures my imagination in reading it was interesting. I mean, you really start and it's really personal, telling personal stories that help us in some ways. I mean, it's your story, and yet like this is like so common, like in terms of the economics of it, right?
Yeah.
Because so many, as we we're saying already, like so many hardworking Black folk have just continued to struggle, and even when you think about like college educated middle class Black people, you still have them having significantly less wealth than their white counterparts. Like, how do you understand it in your own narrative, and then broader in terms of like what so many Black Americans are struggling with on the economic front?
Yeah, brother, it's so deep and layered. Like we just have no clue systemically how this stuff is working, right? So even right now, one of the books I'm reading for my doctorate is The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. And it's talking about the nonprofit industrial complex, right?
Yeah.
And we're having this conversation right now on a platform for my nonprofit, which is intentional, right? Because I could have just put it on my own platform, but I want to draw people to the good work we're doing at a nonprofit that's providing leadership education for Black and brown girls, not exclusively, but that's a lot of our audience. And that's led by a Black woman, because it's not funded, right? Like we are funding it as we're working for free. And, on the flip side of that, watching how, white people will not only have nonprofits, but then have those nonprofits funded by foundations, and the foundations are used as tax shelters, because they don't want to pay taxes on their estates and the things that they inherit. And most of us, in our families, that only thing we inherit is a debt from the funeral we can't pay for.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm telling you from personal experience, that's what we inherited. Right. And I think that people need to understand the inadequacies of not just wealth, but the lack of even education regarding wealth, right? The education regarding education, because it's not just about going to school and getting a degree, but how can you do that and have that degree work for you and not have so much debt that the money is out the door before you even get in. And so I came into adulthood and into marriage with no financial education. None. Right? And the only thing I knew was that I don't want collectors calling me. So what I have to do to make that a reality? And I thought if I was never having collectors calling me, I was winning that life financially. But then you have, other people that they're having different conversations. They're setting their kids up in different ways. And so I'm just saying that there's an education gap, there's a knowledge gap, but more than that, Drew, there's an access and opportunity gap. there's an access and opportunity gap. And so, and this is where for people, and I would say, you know, a lot of white people that are have the financial resources and means and or relationships and network, and they want to do anti-racist work, we do have to put our money where our mouth is, right? Because there's so much injustices and inadequacies. And I'm encouraged because I am seeing some of this happen. You know, one of my classmates, he was like, you know, there's a white church in his community that's decided they're tithing to some of the Black churches in their local community. I'm like, Les, please do that, you know, and people supporting, you know, Black owned businesses and Black led organizations and like, you know, like this one. And so I think all of those things, because they're systemic things, education, right? Especially now, like a lot of our kids are in public school. And we know that not only is their education subpar, because a lot of that education historically is tied to taxes that come from income that's, you know, that they receive from housing. And, you know, if you have people that are renting and they're not owning, then their schools are not getting the funds that they need for the kids to get the resources that they need to get educated. So not only are they getting a subpar educated, this is the whole school to prison pipeline, right? Like they're building prisons based on a Black kids reading level in 3rd grade.
Right. That's right.
That's what they're doing. Because they're saying based on that, that's how many prisons we're setting them up for. And so they're setting our kids up for failure. So they're getting failed all throughout the academic year. Then they have a summer slump where they're not getting engaged. And now because of this pandemic we're in, right, that summer slump is going to turn to how long? Right. So we're going to have a whole generation of kids, poor Black and brown kids. What do we think going to happen to them if the church and some other people who have some means doesn't step up and provide some opportunities, right? Because they can't virtually learn if they don't have the internet at home.
Right.
Or they don't have a laptop, right? Like these are all things. And so there's just so many systemic inadequacies and that we really have to, we don't often know about because it's not in our face. And so I'm saying the history part of this is that we have to understand, even in our local community, it could be 10, 15 minutes down the street, how people are living different than us and what role we might be able to play as good neighbors to, I wouldn't say level the playing field, because I would say you got to do more than level the playing field at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, you know, one of the best books I've read, thinking about economics, there's a book called— I see
a note saying it will get to you. She's got a note there. Go ahead.
The Color of Money.
Yes.
It's a just beautiful, well written, just moves you decade by decade, right, all the way through, and it just helps you to begin to see, like, as you said, the systemic realities in terms of access and opportunities. And I mean, even the way that, you know, you had Black people putting all their money into these Black banks, but that even that, which they had all this hope and energy around, but because they were neglected and separated from the mainstream economy and no one invested in those communities, like they were set up for failure, right?
Yeah.
And so you have these systemic structures on top of what I already described earlier, which was policies that were actually created, government handouts and policies designed to help white families become middle class as Black people are excluded from it, right? And so you have these just compounding problems that people are facing. And then on top of that, you add struggling schools, right, that are under-resourced. We're feeling this. I mean, the neighborhood that I live in, it's 50% Black, large Latinx community, and our schools are struggling right now.
Yeah.
And we're having hard conversations as a family because we've always, on one hand, we've tried to be like, all right, how do we live in solidarity with our communities? But like, when you know this next year coming up, they're going to drop the ball. What do you do, right?
And you're not going to sacrifice your kid,
right? Sacrifice
and you shouldn't. You shouldn't sacrifice your kid, you know. And I think it's you know, it goes both ways too, right? Because it's like my daughter's in private school, and here they are saying she's gonna go back to school without a master's optional. I'm like, she's not going back to school with a master's being optional, because part of the history and understanding of this is that like she has to, like, her resistance is staying alive.
Right. That's right. So how do we do this work where we are both taking care of our community as much as we're able to, and not leave people behind, right? Like that's what I struggle with, is how do I do this work and not leave other people behind? Because I tell folks, like, look, my kids are going to be okay. Look, because we even during the summer, like we're doing math and reading and all this stuff. Like, look, so my kids are going to be, they have the benefit of having a father that's got a PhD, the mom's got a college degree, we're actually masters. I mean, it's a whole different thing for folks that don't have that educational advantages, right?
And this is what I say to people. I'm going to say this, and then we're going to go and do some announcements and let people start filling your questions. Start flooding the chat box with questions now. We're going to start taking questions here soon. But one of the things I would say, because everyone's in a different, let's go back to the very beginning of the conversation, a different location of this kind of race and place. And so I think that's a good place to kind of wrap this up because all of us can do something.
Right.
We can all do something. And so I want us to be asking the question, and we just like education, like we're an education organization. So that's a really, really big thing. And I don't take it lightly because I understand that that's going to directly impact not just these kids, but the generations coming after them.
That's right.
Right. And so I think that's critically important. And so one of the ways that people are saying, well, what can I do? To start asking the question right now, like what provisions are being made for the Black and brown children in your community in light of everything that's going on? That's a very critical question. And then to say, okay, now that I know this, what could I possibly do, to help? I mean, if you have a computer, you can do online tutoring, you can do online learning. You can do that stuff for free or cheap. And so I think we need to really think about that, especially over the course of this next year. So let's think about that. Okay, start sending some questions. Let me make some announcements. If you're on Facebook, I encourage you to go ahead and send some questions in there, and we will be consolidating them. And while I'm consolidating them, let me go ahead, while we are feeding them, getting the questions in, let me go ahead and make a few announcements. So, if you're looking to continue the conversation, you're saying, I want a little bit more, there's a few ways you can do that. So one is, obviously, you can join us next week. You only need to register, and I think I put this on another slide or mentioned it previously. You only need to register for the series once. So if you are already on Zoom, you don't need to register again, but you encourage other people to register. But also, if you're on Facebook and you haven't, join us next week, same time. We'll continue the conversation the next 2 weeks. But I also have a podcast, A Sojourner's Truth. In the first season, we focus on the contents of this book. So what you see here on the slide is my aunt. She's on my left, so I don't know what side she's on your screen. But she talks a little bit more at the beginning of our conversation about this race and place. What was it like? From her perspective, growing up in a town like ours. And then my favorite episode of this whole season one was with one of my mentors and godmothers, Mrs. Joyce Garrett. Joyce Garrett attended Bennett University, which is a historically Black college and university in Greensboro. And she was a part of the sit-ins there. And she went to jail as a result of that. And so she shares about that whole experience in the civil rights movement. It was just such a rich conversation. So I encourage you to do that. A Sojourner's Truth podcast is available now on Spotify and on iTunes. Next, we'll continue the conversation with Shane Blackshear. He's a podcaster and a friend, and we're going to talk about wilderness. So the wilderness experience is going to be chapters 8 through 11. So if you're reading along with us, that's what we'll discuss next time. Then we are a praying people. We like to say that Leadership Links is a faith-informed organization. And when we say that, we mean part of the thing that we do a lot is that we are grounded as people of prayer. So we want to invite you to join us on the third Saturday of each month. So our next network prayer call is this Saturday. It's the same time, same dial-in information. And so if you're available, you can just call in while you're drinking your coffee or in your robe, and we would love for you to join us then. Lastly, regarding programming, or I guess first regarding programming, because some people are asking, well, what are you doing? And what are you doing, especially in light of the pandemic? So one of the things I told you about early on is that we are intentional in investing and raising up the next generation of leaders. And we do that in very, very intentional ways for both leadership and mentoring. And so we've continued our youth programming throughout the pandemic. And this year, we're going to continue our Links mentoring program throughout the academic year virtually. So I'll have some more specifics for that for you next week. And we also have an essay competition coming up that's going to be available for the public, middle and high school girls. Anyone could apply for that, and it's a cash reward. So I want to let you know that those are a couple of things we have coming up. And since we're talking about history tonight, one of the things that we had planned for this summer that we had to unfortunately postpone for next summer is our first global leadership experience tour. We were planning to take a 12-day road trip from North Carolina to Canada, charting the Underground Railroad north. And so now we are planning to do that next summer. And so that's one of the things that we'll be funding for those who support the organization. And then you might want to know, how can I stay in touch? How can I get the most up-to-date information, especially once we wrap up this series? The best ways to do that is to follow us on social media. So this live that's on Facebook, we're going to also upload it to our YouTube channel. We're trying to customize that channel, so we would really love for you to help us tonight get to 100 followers or subscribers on YouTube so we can customize that channel. The other things, though, the other ways you can connect with us is through Instagram, through LinkedIn, through Twitter. And if you want to be among the first to get the details of programming and stuff like that, we encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter on our website and add our secretary's email address to your contacts so that doesn't go into your junk folder. Lastly, if you're saying, okay, how can I get involved and how can I volunteer with what you're doing at Leadership Links? Well, if you go to our website, there's a service opportunities tab link there. And when you click on service opportunities, there's a volunteer application. It'll take you 10 minutes, maybe 15. Just lets us get to know you better and some of the things that you're passionate about and some of the things you're good at, so we can plug you in with the right committee to help us serve. And also, mentoring is critically important. And so if you find that you want to be a guest speaker or you want to get involved in our mentoring program in some way, we're starting to get people to come in as observers in the mentoring program this year. And then you'll be prepared to go through some training to lead with us next year. And then these are some other things that we need as an organization as far as volunteerism. If you are a person that you do marketing design, graphic design, you're interested in research, you're skilled in technology, those type of things, you're admin, strong administrator. If any of those things are appealing to you, then we could use your support. And so we encourage you to fill out that volunteer form and let us know those things, and we'll have someone get in contact with you. So we are going to take questions right now. So let's see what we have coming in here. Do we have some questions coming in through our inbox in our chat session? Let's see, we got some time. So, okay, let's see. You want to start at the bottom and work our way up, or we want to start at the top and work our way down? What are we doing?
To you. I see that question right at the bottom, but.
Okay, let me start there then. I'll start at the bottom and work my way backwards. Why do you think Americans in particular have a harder time with truth telling in regards to history?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is it a peculiar dark side to the American civic spirit? That's interesting. And or are we not so exceptional and are just one of the many countries that have this problem? Is it the few countries that are successful at truth telling that are distinctive? Good question. Thank you so much for that. Go ahead. I'll let you take it, sir. Doctor?
Yeah. I think that one of the things that make our situation a little bit different than some of the other countries that engaged in colonialism is that, let's say for like the United Kingdom, like most of their slavery was done like offshores, right? They're like colonizing other places, but they weren't bringing like millions of Black people to their own land. So it was kind of out of sight, out of mind exploitation that was happening there.
Mm-hmm,
What happened
mm-hmm.
in the US is a little bit different, right? There's a kind of intimacy because literally, at the minimum, 10 million people are brought over here to be enslaved for labor. And there's a really close, intimate relationship that formed out of that. And you think about at every given key moments of struggle in our country has been about race, right? The Civil War, civil rights. I mean, these over and over again, we're having these moments. And I think that it's a more intimate problem, and it says something a little bit more about us as a nation. And because America has such a strong narrative of exceptionalism, like it's hard to own up to, in some ways, exceptional oppression and domination, right? Really,
Right.
The narratives don't work together, right? Either we are just this born for justice and freedom loving people that were always oriented in that way, or we're a nation that was formed under genocide and the forcible removal of the indigenous people of this land and the enslavement of African people, and that was the foundation of our nation. Like both of those narratives can't exist at the same time. And I think that the intimacy of it's personal. It's people's own sense of who they are as individuals, as communities, and as a nation. It's harder to grapple with, I think. I think that's why there's so much denial. And I think that it's a little bit easier in some contexts, though, to be fair, like what happened in Germany was also intimate. And they were able to, but maybe that, I don't think Germany's entire existence up to that point was quite the same kind of, for the centuries leading up to it, the same kind of animosity and intimate oppression that was happening in that land for so long, And
here's the thing, right? It's not just the oppression, right? It's the stories we tell.
Right, and the stories we tell.
So you can't be great and not great at the same time.
Right.
Like you can't be a Christian nation and then behave unchristian at the same time.
Right.
And so the problem is, I think, with us is that we've only been told one part of the story. And so when the wool, is pulled back and the blinders are taken off, then we don't know what to do, because it's such a affront to what we've always been told and was seared in us as true. Like, this is a Christian nation, and we are great, and we are a place that welcomes everybody, and anybody who comes here and work hard, you can obtain the American dream. That's the narrative.
That's the strong narrative.
That's the narrative, but that's not the truth.
Right. That's right.
That's not the truth, and so I've been wanting to get a quote in off of trouble I've seen right here. I want to get a quote in, but this is one thing you said, and I think it's important to tie in here, because you said those in dominant culture are now free to commune with oppressed people and to learn from them how to see a truer social reality, one closer to the vantage point of our crucified Christ. The challenge here is to trust the intuition of oppressed people over against one's own gut and experience, which has proven to lead dominant groups astray. And the reason I think that's critically important, because we've read plenty of research. Pew Research has put this out about so many white people don't have relationships with people that are trusted relationships with people that are not white in our country. Right? There's a lot of research about this. And so because of that, it's easy to be blinded, because either everyone you're around or the majority of people you're around have the same lack of knowledge, or they're agreeing to the same narrative. And so it's not until you are reading other things or experiencing in relationship with people who experience these same facts in a different way do you start to really wrestle with the narrative that you've been told.
Right.
And I would say that the narrative is good. So we definitely need to keep wrestling with the narrative.
Yeah.
We have a question here. Yeah, we're familiar with, I'm familiar with Body. Someone asked, are you still doing the program, the boys mentoring program in Harrisburg? we mentioned it in your bio. They're asking, are you still doing that?
No, so that was something I did when I first lived in Harrisburg. I'm in my second round now, living in Harrisburg. But from 05 to 08, I was a youth pastor and also working in an after-school program for middle school boys who are under-resourced, primarily Black and brown. But that's not a part of the work that I do right now.
Okay. And someone was saying about they just really appreciate the writing on 63 through 68. And that was about the consciousness. So we've talked about that. Let's see if there are any other. Oh, another question here. I really enjoyed last week's discussion. I learned a lot from these 3 chapters we're discussing tonight. One thing I like to mention is that I heard from pastors that the church is truly a hospital for the sick, but sometimes it becomes a country club in people's minds. Are people coming to be cleansed of their sin and worship the Lord, or are they lukewarm pew warmers? If a church body representing the bride of Christ, is it healthy? It will be led, if it's healthy, it will be led by Bible preaching pastor so that true repentance, healing, and fruit bearing can be a result. Amen, sister. True racial reconciliation will start in a healthy church where there are people from many different backgrounds. And if Blacks have experienced racism at white church, then it's personal sin that displeases the Lord. Yeah. Okay, Sandy. Anything you got to say about that to Sandy? Sandy was engaging in the conversation. I'm with you, girl.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I do think though our church, they need to be more than like, I know we use it sometimes in the churches like Bible believing churches and things like that. I think that's not quite enough yet, right? I mean, better than not Bible believing, but we need to actually be like discipling churches that are committed to the way of Jesus. And I'm always surprised at how many people who they believe in the Bible, but yet skirt the life and teachings of Jesus, and it has no implications for how they live their lives, right? And I think that's how you can enslave somebody, right? But you say a prayer and you believe that you're fine because you said some prayer or something like that, but you're not necessarily committed to the way of Jesus, to the life of Jesus. And so I think that that we've got to go one step further than just being Bible believing and become communities that are discipling people in the way and life of Jesus, committed to his death and resurrection in terms of the way that we actually live in the world and love people like God taught us to love God and love our neighbor, including our enemies, including the Samaritans and those who are most vulnerable in our midst.
Yeah, and I think it's another challenge we have to name. When this question came up when you were talking, I was thinking about a quote I saw today. So our friend, I think you know Dr. Esau McCauley.
Oh yeah.
So he put a post up today. It was like, when people talk about how our faith impacts parenting, no one says just preach the gospel. And when we talk about how it impacts relationships, no one says just preach the gospel. Right. Preaching involves discipling. And if discipling is to be biblical, it must address injustice. And so what happens is we use all this language to avoid the conversation about terrorism. I think someone was asking a question about that, about racism. And because we're saying then it's a distraction from preaching the gospel. And I would say to not have those honest conversations is actually a problematic, because then we're not teaching people. Being a disciple means following. It means being a student and a learner. And we're not teaching people how to be a student or a learner or to follow in the midst of their present reality. Right. Which is what we really need to do. And so I would submit that it's actually bad news when we're doing that, not good news, which is what the Bible says. So I think we have time for one more question. Consciousness of false repentance, and then one about financial literacy, maybe part. Yeah. Well, I agree that we need some financial literacy, but I think the other reality is, and this is a systemic thing, right? It's not just about knowledge. It's about the way the systems are set up. And so that's where I think we have to, do some more challenging work, not just about education, but also in the boardrooms. Also, when we look at who's getting hired, also when we look at who's getting paid what for the same job, all these things that we all, in other words, it's not the responsibility of just one church or one NGO. But I want us to understand that we all have a responsibility and a commitment to work towards justice. And I think sometimes the challenge is we want to see results. And I like seeing results too. But you and I know this work requires us to be intentional and consistent, and it's never really done.
Right.
It's never really done, you know. And so that's the thing with that. I think, so we'll take this last question for real, this last one. I think we can do it. What is true repentance? And is there such a thing as a conscious false repentance? Oh, I don't know about that. And you're in London too? Come on, welcome, London, Tamara. Welcome. And there was a question too about terrorism. Is it important to use that language? So I won't say a whole bunch about repentance, because what I will say is that what we don't know what's in a person's heart. We only know what we see. And so where the Bible tells us that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So we have some idea about what's in a person's heart by what they say, right? But we also have some idea about what's in their heart, but by how they act, right? So you could say you love people, but then if you behave in very unloving ways or ways that they don't perceive to be loved, then there's a disconnect there. And so that's what we can assess, but we can't really assess what truly is going on in a person's heart. And I think too, when we're dealing about stuff with like systemic racism and injustice and these things, I think it's important to say too that people are on a journey with this, right? And so this is another thing, like you may be someplace today that's very challenging or uninformed. And so the commitment you will make as someone who wants to grow in wisdom, knowledge, understanding, and love is to not continue to be in that place. That you're going to get better all the time, that you're going to educate yourself out of the ignorance, that you're going to be uncomfortable to take the risks and develop relationships with other people, that you're going to sacrifice and make some commitments for a more equitable and just society. I think those things are important. You get the last word about, wrap up about, is it important for us to use the language terrorism when we're talking about racial acts in our country? And any save rounds, last point you want to make about the book before we close?
Yeah, I do think that the language of terrorism is important because we want to describe what was actually happening, right? It's easy. I mean, it's interesting. We love to talk about terrorism when it's external, but when Black people I mean, I don't know, how else do we describe Black people trying to be put in their place, hung on trees, tarred and feathered, burning burning crosses in the yards. I mean, this is terrorism. And there's trauma, there's generational trauma in the Black community because of the kind of, and so when Black people left the South, so many, not everyone, but when people were fleeing all over the place, they were fleeing like refugees, right?
Yeah.
Because there was terrorism happening. And so many of the story, I know so many people who their family, the story for them leaving was because of, if they didn't stay around, they'd have been dead, right? They looked at some white man in his eyes, or this or that, something happened, and they needed to get on the train immediately and get out of there, or they weren't going to be alive. I don't know any better word than terrorism to describe that. And then the other thing was, so just wrapping up on the book, and you wrap up, I mean, we almost got there in terms of just the economics, but then you moved the conversation towards trust, right? And trust in God, which is really powerful. And I think that in these moments, it can almost feel counterintuitive, but it's really powerful when we can kind of tap into the same trust in God that I think our ancestors, those that came before us, had. Right? It's just so important to lean in these moments. And the other thing that really struck me, there's a quote, and I'll read it. You said, "The problem with Pharaoh in Egypt is they think they have more power than they do. And the problem with us is that too often we believe them," right? And I just think that just frames so well for us, just the kind of reorientation that we need to remember, right? That God is able. We can sometimes put too much, and sometimes it's literally by investing power in others that we allow them to have power, right? And if we would released that they say that dictators only have power because people submit to them, right?
Yeah.
And that's just, and so what does it mean for us to really to yield to God in these moments? I think it's really powerful.
Mm.
Anyway, thank you for your work, Natasha. It's just so, it's
Thank
brilliant.
you.
Everyone needs to read it. I really enjoyed rereading it again. And so, yeah.
Thank you so much, brother. And so let's do this. We like to close with our creed, but I also want to just remind you of our bookstore that's available. You can get those books, anything at the IVP bookstore for 40% off. And so this is the code, your discount code for you to do that. And we put the link in the website for the customized bookstore, but anything on their website you can get for that. And then thank you, dear friend, Dr. Drew G.I. Hart. Again, I shared his book. I think I'm on the screen, of Trouble I've Seen. I've read it, dog tagged it, quoted often and shared with people, changing the way the church views racism. And I remember you start out this book just kind of talking about trauma and terrorism. Several of the Black people that we've lost due to state and police violence just in the last decade. You start with 1981 and just start going from there to Rodney King and continuing on through Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis. And unfortunately, seems like every few weeks we're adding a new person named to the list. And that's how you start this book. And so we want to get knowledgeable about history. That's one resource I would highly recommend. And then I encourage you to get his upcoming release, Who Will Be a Witness. I've already pre-ordered, so it's available for pre-order now, and that's coming out on September 11th. So as you're continuing your book discussions and your growth of knowledge and education and understanding, to encourage you to not just get one for yourself, but maybe gather your friends virtually and have a discussion on that as well. And then we close all of our Leadership Links event with our Leadership Links Creed. This is who we are as a people, and this informs what we do. This is who we are as a community. And so I will share that with you now, that I am Leadership Links, part of a community founded on love, inspiration, network, knowledge, and service. I am never alone in this world. God has strategically placed me in the right place at the right time and connected me to the right people to fulfill the purpose He has for my life. Therefore, I will actively take part in the great work God is doing in the world. I promise to always stand, reach out, and link up. Thank you all for linking up with us and joining us this evening. We invite you to continue the conversation next week. Thank you, my friend, for joining us this evening and taking the time. I really appreciate that. And it's always good to be in conversation with you.
Yep, always, always.
God bless you. You all have a good night. Until next time. Bye-bye.